This is the Buchla Infinite Phase Shifter Model 297. This module occupies a very unique place in Buchla history. It's pretty much directly between Buchla 200 in the 1970s and Buchla 200E of the early to mid 21st century. You could say that this module sort of bridges the two generations together. And the way this module came about is a really interesting story in its own right. In this segment, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background about this module, what makes it so unique, and then we'll explore this patch that I have going on right now and a little bit more of the capabilities of the 297 and how I like to use it in the small 10-space Skylab that I'm using right now. So first, let's take a little bit of a history lesson. When I was researching the 297, I read the manual, and it's a couple of paragraphs, and I'll be honest, it's not super helpful. Kind of explains what a phaser does and a little bit about the Barber Pole section. But other than Kent's video that he recently posted, there's not a lot of really great content out there about how this thing works. In fact, this is my second 297. I sold the first one because I quite honestly just couldn't figure it out. And it was only when I expanded my system a bit and found a place for it that I had to have it again. So I went online and found on the Internet Web Archive at archive.org a snapshot of the Buchla.com site from April 2002. So let me read for you just a little bit of what Don wrote. Here's the story of the 297. A notorious analog aficionado and active performer, whom we'll call Dave, pointed out a minor deficiency in our 200 series catalog, no Barber Poles. So in the 200 series module catalog, which ended in the 70s, there's no Barber Pole, and this guy Dave wanted them in his setup, so he went to Don and asked for them. Besides ourselves with embarrassment, we snuck into our long, mothballed design studio and, working feverishly around the clock, repaired this deficiency with not one but two new Barber Pole modules. That's the 260 duophonic pitch class generator and the Infinite Phase Shifter 297. And then it goes on to say, now don't get too excited and see this as Buchla resuming production of 200 series analog synths. We're simply filling in a gap that we inadvertently overlooked some 25 years ago. In 2002 is when he wrote this. That's fascinating because the 200E is just, I don't think that was even on the horizon. Buchla was making controllers like the Lumina and the Thunder at the time, around that time. So puts this as a Buchla 200 series module, not a 200E module. That's why the 297 doesn't have an E at the end of it. You don't have to say, where's the E? Because there is no E. This is a 200 series module, just like the MARF 248 and the 245 sequencer and the 227 system interface and so on. That's really interesting, right? That's pretty cool because it only came out 20 years ago. But then when you think that 20 years ago was 25 years after the 200 series came out, it's sort of like it's right there in that middle, kind of bisects the history of Buchla. And because it was made for a particular customer, it has touches that were specific to that customer. It says Dave's Barber Shop down at the bottom of the module, named after Dave, the guy who requested it. And its design aesthetic reflects the 200 series design, but then a little bit of a preview, just a tiny bit of a preview of where the 200E was going to go with this nice big LED at the bottom. The switches aren't buttons, they're switches. Nice big hard switches, just like you'd find on a 207 or 207R, or any of the clone modules that you find nowadays. So as I was reading about this more, I thought, a phaser, a whole module for a phaser, even one with the Barber Pole. Well, what does that mean, even with a Barber Pole? And why did Don say that analog synths had Barber Poles in the past? What was that all about? So a little bit reading more, Don describes that as thus. Now, just what is a Barber Pole module? A barber pole is a spiral that slowly turns around a vertical axis. The actual movement is rotational and horizontal. The perceived movement is vertical but illusory. The term has been applied to processes in which movement is perceived to occur continuously in one direction, but ultimately there is no net movement in that direction. So that makes sense. If you've ever seen a barber pole at the old-fashioned barbers, it looks like it just continues forever. And the 260 duophonic pitch class generator, which is the other barber pole module, is it does the Shepard tone paradox. So that's the sound that as it rises or falls, seems like it's never going to end. The 297 uses the barber pole for the phaser, and it results in an interesting effect that we'll get into in just a minute. I want to conclude this opening here with some more of what Don wrote about the infinite phase shifter specifically. We've all heard the output of those little stomp boxes called phase shifters or phasers. By mixing an unprocessed signal with a phase-shifted version, they'll create a type of cone filter, and if the degree of phase shift is cyclically varied, the filter peaks move up and down at a user-specified rate. So he's just pretty much described how a phaser works. We've heard phasers on lots of stuff. Something that comes to mind is on the drums on Led Zeppelin song Kashmir. So Don continues, infinite phasing, in which these peaks move continually in one direction, was first introduced in 1981 by the Bode Sound Company, but very few devices were manufactured and the idea has since been abandoned. It seemed interesting and challenging to us, so we designed one. And here it is. So what I have going on in this patch right now is I'm using my Keen 282E quad transient generator to output two functions. One function goes to the 268E graphic waveform generator to draw the waveform, and another copy of that function goes to, or transient in Keen parlance, goes to the sweep oscillator on the 297, which I'll explain in just a moment. And then the other transient is going to the resonance input on the 297. And then I have a 281E going into the CV input on Dave's Barbershop, which is just sweeping the rate of change from minus 30 semitones per second to 30 semitones per second, so 2.5 octaves. I have the phase shift center set to 4 kilohertz. The sweep oscillator is mapped to 32 hertz, and the CV input potentiometer is fully counterclockwise. Notch is set right to the middle, and resonance is set to 4. So that's actually a very basic patch. If you watch the video either as a Patreon subscriber when this episode comes out or 2 months after this episode airs, you'll see that this is super basic. It sounds like I've said a lot, but there's really not much going on here, even though what you're hearing is a really cool kind of sweeping drone. Now, some of the credit goes to the Keen 282E because I can draw a complex CV with that, but you could accomplish something similar with a 266E source of uncertainty, or the 281E quad function generator, or any CV source, 223E, and then send that through like a 256E or 257E to shape the control voltages. But the point is that the CV is really interesting. So as I mess around with this, I will change to a different stage, go up to stage 8. Brought that up, I'll volume up a bit. Stage 10. That's interesting. Yeah. So I've had this going for probably about 45 minutes while I did a bit of reading and such to prepare for the segment, and I like it. It's got movement, but it's a little bit unpredictable when that movement comes in because of the shape of the CV that I'm sending in. So it's pretty cool. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug this patch. Leave that. I'm going to take out all my CV sources here because I want to give you a good idea of what you start with. So everything comes out. Turn off my reverb. So all I have plugged in now is I'll go to bypass, and I'm going to take the noise out. I'll take the flat noise out from the 266E source of uncertainty, and we'll go to so I'm going to start by having both outputs coming firmly from the first input. There we go. And so that's just noise. And it is, I've got the 297 in bypass, so nothing's happening. It's just the noise. But as I start, if I put the stages into, let's say, 5, and then sweep, and I'll move the sweep oscillator down to 0.5, turn the resonance up to about halfway. You can hear that's the sweep oscillator. And so this is the fully wet signal right now. So I'll just sweep the rate of change. Turn the sweep oscillator down so you can hear that a bit better. And that rate of change sweep becomes more apparent when I turn the resonance up. Now when I go up from 6 to 10 and sweep the rate of change, it'll have a lot more, I guess you could say it's broader. So if we just wait patiently, that sweep oscillator, which is running at 0.03 hertz, here it goes. That's pretty cool. I use this a lot on 7-dot waves to give kind of the sound with the 272E polyphonic tuner to make it sound like there was lots of static and noise on like a two-way radio in the Arctic. So it's a pretty good effect. Okay. Well, let me plug that noise back in. The one I want to demonstrate now is I've got this fully wet, and it should be coming out of both channels. When I move the right channel over, and I bring the notch to the right in the middle, and then bring up the right channel. So you're hearing the wet signal and the dry signal kind of mixed together into the two channels. And there's a subtle movement between them. This works really well with headphones on. There's kind of a subtle movement between them as they go into and out of phase. Bring that down to like 7 so you can hear a little bit. Turn up the sweep oscillator. Yeah. So to me, I hear it kind of in my left ear, and then it moves over into the right ear. And I don't want, I'm sure I could explain that and use like an oscilloscope or a meter to show what's happening there, but I like to let the sort of illusion happen. That's why my back is to my computer. Okay, so I'm going to bring it back to one channel because I'm going to stick with the wet signal for now. And I'll take the noise out. And since there aren't very many of these 268Es out there, I will use a different oscillator. I'll use the 259E, and we'll patch that into the 297. Turn off my modulation. so here's the dry signal. Choose a different, there we go. Had it on the twisted mode, and that's kind of tough to make out. Okay, so this is the 297 with no modulation. The modulation oscillator is turned off. And you're hearing a little bit of movement there because the 297 is doing its thing. But when I move the notch all the way over to 0 and we get the wet signal. Now, if you have a 259E, that might sound a little bit like the modulation oscillator doing its thing, or similar to how the 261E modulates amplitude in the modulation oscillator will modulate amplitude in the 261E. So as I start messing with the knobs, this is the sweep oscillator here. And then now I'll just turn warp on the 259. So again, all that modulation is happening only in the 297, other than me turning the warp knob. So now I'm going to try out the Barber Pole. Now, let me back up just a second. I realize, I own this module, I know a lot about it. I can just start using it, but for you might not actually know kind of how it's laid out. So I'll take a second to explain that, and then I'll get back into the Dave's Barbershop. It has a signal input on the top with an envelope follower out, fast, medium, and slow envelopes from the incoming signal, and you can switch between those with a nice switch. 2 signal outputs, Phi1 and Phi2, Phi the Greek letter, and the letter in the Greek alphabet. That's spelled PHI, kind of like phase. Then there's a phase shift center section that has a CV input and a pot for that, and a attenuator for that. Phase shift center, which goes from 250 to 4 kilohertz, and that has to do with how out of phase, or how you can shift the incoming signal, the number of phases by a certain, I think it's 1800 degrees. I'm not an expert on that, so I'll defer to the manual. Then there's a bypass, a switch that goes from bypass to, which is off, and it's a yellow LED. And then you get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stages. And that will affect, that's 10, and then just going down. And then there's a notch input and a pot for going from 0 to 10. Can think of notch kind of like this is a comb filter, and in the middle is a one tooth, and you're kind of going between the left side and the right side of that tooth. Kind of a simple way of explaining that. Next is the sweep oscillator frequency section, and that's what gives it that wah-wah sound. That. So as I turn it up, it gets up to 32 hertz, and then down to 0.03, and then it has a frequency CV input and a depth CV input. And turn that up a bit so you can hear the depth. So with the oscillator maxed, here's max depth, and as I back depth off, it changes the amount of modulation of the sweep oscillator. Then the resonance is just like you would think resonance on a filter. And then the last section is Dave's Barbershop, which is a good third of the module. And it has a CV input, some really pretty graphics around the Barber Pole, a switch that says out to lunch for off, you're next for on, then a nice big potentiometer for rate of change sweeping from minus 30 semitones per second to 30 semitones per second, 2.5 octaves. And this is sort of like the big knob you would find on it's not the same, but it's sort of like the big knob you would find on a krautrock phaser, like on a Heibo krautrock phaser. In fact, Heimbach recently got a krautrock phaser and posted a video about it. And I was like, dude, that sounds a lot like the 297 infinite phase shifter. Because there's turning that rate of change with the sweep oscillator is pretty similar. So you can do some really cool con or noi or something really cool like that, Klosta, to do some classic krautrock. And so what makes this so great in terms of doing phase shifting and the Barber Pole and all of that is all of this stuff is under voltage control. That's what makes it different from a normal phaser. And then of course the infinite accession, which I have talked enough about, so let me show you the Dave's Barber Shop. I'm going to set the rate of change to the middle so the LED turns off. When the LED is lit green, it's descending, and when it's lit red, it's ascending. I feel like that should be the other way around, but that's okay. Now I'm going to just set a small sound here. Design something a little bit to maybe 8. So there's the sweep oscillator. Yeah, so I've got the stage set to 9. Notch is at 0, so you get the full wet signal. And I'm going to turn on the barbershop. So as I move this to the left and right, it will change the descending and ascending phase, and you'll hear that Barber Pole phasing. Trying to find a better sound. So I'll go up. Trying to find a different phase, 7 maybe. Kind of hear that. So let me go to just the modulation oscillator output. Okay, here we go. There, had the sweep oscillator turned up too high, so it was hard to hear. So you can hear the sweep oscillator, or the rate of change Barber Pole, bringing the phase shifting down about 6 semitones per second. The phase is down to about 5. So here's off. That's on. So going back to my 259. Now when I turn on my so that's the sweep oscillators turned up pretty high. Resonant, so pretty much everything's turned up max. Change it to the 8. It's pretty wild. Let's see, I'll turn some reverb back on. Got kind of a little bit of an aggressive reverb for this. Cool. So yeah, I mean, when you start exploring like all these different control voltage sources, and you deal with, like, you get both of the signals coming out. Like, I'll bring that back in. like this. You mix them together, or maybe pan between them, or sweep the notch and pan between them and move them around, with the 227E swirl. And you could get some really cool sounds. This is all 259E and 297. The 297 Infinite Phase Shifter is a fantastic module full of all kinds of possibilities for sonic character. And with almost everything being under voltage control, really the possibilities are endless. It chooses a CV source, anything from an envelope to something complex coming from the 266E, really anything, and you can have all kinds of fascinating and happy accidents even with the settings and the 297, and getting some sounds that kind of go beyond what one might think of it coming from a phaser, and I love that about the module. And the other thing I really love about this that is not something really you can hear, but I like the connection to the past. I like that it's a Buchla 200 series module, a precursor to the 200E, Don's return to making Buchla modules. I like that. I like being connected to that little piece of history. And so it just fills kind of a special spot in our Buchla systems. And it's just really a joy to play with.